In the summer of 2011, a group of friends and I decided to plan a small camping trip to a forest just a few miles outside her hometown. Although Delamere Forest was relatively small, it offered a much-needed escape to nature. City life has its perks, but it can feel suffocating, so any chance to retreat to the countryside was always welcome. But as the camping trip neared, things started to go wrong. One by one, friends began canceling, citing reasons like family illness, lack of funds, or just plain laziness. Eventually, only two of us decided to go. Early on a sunny summer morning, we boarded a train for the forest. The weather was perfect, a clear sky with a gentle breeze that made our hike through the woods more bearable than expected. We soon found a good spot in the shade, right by a stream we could use for drinking and washing. The only problem was that the area was very open and visible from the nearby trails, making it far from discreet. By late afternoon, tired from our hike, we decided to build a fire to cook dinner. Building a fire is a key part of camping. Sure, but it also draws attention. The smell of burning wood and cooking food, along with the smoke, can practically announce your presence to the entire forest. We weren't surprised when a group of locals came across our camp and stopped to say hello. At first, they seemed friendly enough, but I couldn't shake a bad feeling about them. It's interesting how human instincts can pick up on subtle clues, like body language or the way someone talks, that tell us something isn't right. Whether it was the way the locals glanced at each other or the strange questions they asked, I sensed their intentions weren't good. After they left and were out of earshot, my friend suggested we move the camp. Normally, he's the jumpy one who I'm always telling to calm down, but this time I knew he was right. Maybe we were being paranoid, but in situations like this, it's better to be cautious. Even though we were tired and slightly drunk, we packed up, put out the fire, and started searching for another spot. Luckily, we found one quickly, on a wooded hill that overlooked our old campsite. Though we couldn't see it directly, a short walk away gave us a decent view of the area, at least during the day. As the sun set, we lit another fire, cooked some ramen in our mess tins, and then proceeded to drink and smoke until we were too exhausted to continue. We talked nonsense around the fire until we were too tired to stay up, then retreated to our shelters for the night. I must have passed out as soon as I got into my sleeping bag because I don't remember drifting off. The next thing I knew, I woke up in pitch darkness to the sound of a distant car revving its engine. At first, I was just irritated to be woken up. The hangover was hitting hard, and I felt awful as I tried to go back to sleep. But the sound of the car kept getting louder, and I realized it was coming closer. Something urged me to check it out. By the time I heard voices, I thought it might just be some kids joyriding in a stolen car. But, as I mentioned, sometimes it's better to be safe than sorry. When I reached the edge of the hill, I could see flashlights all around our old campsite. The revving engine was from a vehicle that had driven all the way down the forest path to where we had camped earlier. Someone was down there looking for us. I think I acted more on instinct than anything else, quickly and quietly waking my friend. I must have explained what I saw 2 or 3 times before he fully understood. He was just as tired and slightly drunk as I was. But when it finally sank in, he got up and helped me put out our dying fire. We grabbed the binoculars we had with us and ran back to the hill's edge to watch in horror. We could see what the men were holding in their hands. Thanks to the flashlights, they were shining on each other. Baseball bats, hammers, and a length of rope were just a few of the things they carried. They spat and cursed, angry that they had arrived too late to catch us and do who knows what. All we had to defend ourselves were our Swiss Army knives. If those guys had decided to search the area, they would have found us easily, and I'm not sure I'd be here telling this story today. But fortunately, they didn't. Maybe they were drunk themselves or just too lazy to look for us. But thank God they didn't. With one of us keeping watch, the other packed our gear as quickly as possible. The men down below stayed around our old camp, kicking at the fire we had so carefully built, taking out their frustration on the things we had left behind. As I mentioned before, they didn't seem eager to search for us, but they also didn't seem in a hurry to leave. This meant we were stuck on that wooded hill, as trying to escape with our heavy packs would have been risky. If they saw us, there was no way we could outrun them, especially since they had a vehicle. We ended up staying there until morning. Neither of us could sleep, despite the gang leaving with their car. I remember being terrified that they would return, maybe with more people or more determination to find us, but they didn't. They were probably sleeping off their own hangovers by the time we were on the train home. We had planned to stay for another 2 nights, and I was still annoyed that we had to cut the trip short. But with those local thugs around, we didn't want to take any chances. Be careful when you're traveling, whether it's abroad or close to home, because while the kindness of strangers can be heartwarming, some people aren't so friendly. In Scotland a few years back, 2 friends and I took an overnight bus from Liverpool to Dumfries for a week of wild camping. The main difference between wild camping and regular camping is the absence of tents. Wild campers don't use them. Instead, they make basic shelters using ponchos or tarps and sleep on the bare ground. It's not always comfortable, but it's a challenge that toughens you up. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, with hardly any sleep, we tried to navigate the Scottish countryside. Of course, we took a wrong turn. We had about 6.5 miles ahead of us, roughly 9 hours of walking, and we managed to get lost 2 minutes in. I couldn't believe we were that clueless, even at such an early hour. We must have looked like an odd trio as we stopped a passing cyclist to ask for directions. He was typically friendly and helpful, pointing us the right way. We turned a corner and caught sight of a war memorial that served as a navigational checkpoint. We couldn't help but stop, laying our packs on the benches near the memorial to take a breather. The memorial was at a crossroads, reminding me of stories where people would take their own lives and be buried at such places, which made me uneasy. Bathed in warm golden sunlight, we headed southwest towards Gargan Bridge. The pavement was narrow, and we often had to step onto the road to stay level. To our left, a rise revealed our first rabbit, which seemed like a good omen. We pretended to aim at it with imaginary scopes, making popping sounds and rubbing our bellies. The rabbit noticed us and quickly scampered into a hedgerow. We continued walking with our heavy packs, passing a tacky sign of a faux stone house with 2 plastic-looking swords sticking out of it, bearing something in Gaelic. Only in Scotland. One of us panted. We reached Gargan Bridge, crossing the river with an old blacksmith's dwelling at its base. We worked our way up a gentle slope past a local secondary school and reached a farm track. We were making good time, and there were no farmhands in the fields, just grazing livestock. The farmer's house was well kept, but the cattle shed and nearby buildings looked run down, possibly home to bats. Sheep and lambs noticed us and skittered away. We navigated past the cattle shed and clambered over 2 fences to avoid a large waste tank. This maneuver inadvertently put us right in front of another fence, the electrified kind. "Is that electric?" someone asked. I followed the wire with my gaze and saw it connect sharply with a battery unit. I grimaced. It was too high to jump over, and our packs made it impossible to crawl under. I imagined what an electric shock to sensitive areas would feel like. I spotted a large piece of deadwood nearby, surrounded by fresh cow pats like landmines. Carefully avoiding them, I dragged the deadwood to the fence. It was heavy enough to pin it down, and as I stepped over, I heard it buzz faintly. We crossed 2 fields, climbing another fence between them, which was not easy with heavy packs. I took out my phone to film the ascent of the first of many hills. We started to breathe heavily as our packs suddenly felt twice as heavy. We leaned forward to maintain momentum, our steps becoming strained and small. I put the phone away as we reached the steepest point. The banter stopped, and we heaved ourselves up the grassy slope. I started to feel hungry as our first rest point came into view, a planned stop to orient ourselves. We laid down our packs just a few yards away from where we had camped on a previous trip and rested our aching legs. My friend Corky took off his shirt, which was soaked with sweat, and I noticed steam rising from his shoulders. "Jesus, Martin," the other guy exclaimed. "There's actual steam coming off you." We laughed as we took out tobacco and food. Martin and I had the same Scotch oatcakes, which we ate with cheese spread, sharing Martin's Jetboil coffee. The Jetboil was incredibly handy and would almost become the center of our lives for the next week. Corky changed into dry civilian clothes and eyed a tin of all-day breakfast, reading out some of the ingredients. It was much cooler in the shade, and we gazed out across the landscape, either picking bits of oatcake out of our teeth or smoking rolled cigarettes. It was already 7 o'clock in the morning, yet our sleep deprivation made it feel later in the day. This was mildly disorienting, but we estimated our arrival at Lahal Bar by around 10 o'clock. Corky was skeptical, still expecting another obstacle after the wrong turn. His feeling was justified when, after moving slowly but steadily along the ridge of the hill, we reached a small collection of houses that served as a landmark. After some deliberation, we decided to cross a field of cows that had the only fence we could easily cross. We were partly motivated by the idea that it seemed quick and easy, and partly to avoid another more threatening electric fence. About halfway across the field, I noticed the numerous cows beginning to stare at us. Usually, this wouldn't be particularly intimidating, but their numbers and hostile stares made me slow my step. "They're all looking at us," I said. "They're just curious," Martin replied. The cows began walking towards us, spreading out in a line. It reminded me of a battle formation. "They're walking towards us now," I said. "They just want to check us out," Martin reassured. The cows started to trot, then broke into a cumbersome gallop. Corky stopped and started walking backward. "They're running at us." I too stopped and began to turn. Over my shoulder, I saw a small enclosure with electrical conductors in it. "Run, dude, run!" Corky yelped, and we tried to sprint under our packs, which amounted to a hobble. I had already made up my mind. Death by electricity had to be quicker than being trampled. "Don't run!" Martin screamed. The command fired off in my brain instantly. I stopped, spun around, and threw my arms into the air, making myself appear large. Corky did the same, and without a moment's hesitation, the charging cows responded. They stopped, or at least slowed their pace. I heard indistinct shouting from the other side of the field. It was the farmer, bidding us to move along the fence to the gate. "See, we're good. Just keep moving," Martin said, reassured. We moved slowly and compactly, arms outstretched, as the cows surrounded us, jostling for a view. They were aggressive with each other. Some even mounted the cows in front of them to get a better look. "This is fine," I told myself. "This is all going to be okay. Nice cows. This is completely safe." Despite my attempts at reassurance, I was genuinely terrified, limbs shaking as I climbed over the wooden gate. The farmer addressed us. "Hey there, just curious. They just wanted to have a wee look. If you stick to the edge of the field, you'll do all right. If you had gone across, then, well, I don't know. Could you tell us a good route to maybe the house?" I asked. "Yeah, just follow this road here. It's usually quiet. Then turn right at the main road and follow it. Don't turn off into the farm. Just keep going, and you'll find the road to the house." "Okay. Cheers, mate." We were relieved for his help. He seemed mildly interested in us, but was clearly more annoyed by the commotion. Pretty much every time I've told this story since, people have laughed. I get it. A bunch of city kids getting scared by cows is definitely a bit funny. But at the time, it scared the life out of us. Especially when we got home and realized just how much danger we were in. You see, cows kill more people each year than sharks, often in the exact way I described. A hiker or walker cuts across a field instead of going around it, and they get trampled. In fact, The UK Health and Safety Executive has reissued advice to farmers not to put calves and their mothers in fields accessible to the public as a precaution. So, next time you consider taking a shortcut through a field, make sure it's not occupied. You might get an unexpected surprise. One of the oldest regions of its kind in the southern United States, covering almost 2 million acres of untouched wilderness, making it a prime spot for unforgettable hunting experiences. The name Washita is believed to come from the Choctaw words "oa," meaning hunt, and "shoto," meaning big, translating to big hunt far from home. So, during hunting season, the place is packed with hunters in bright orange caps and high-visibility jackets. My friends and I, being East Coasters through and through, never really got into hunting. Until we visited Arkansas, I hadn't even ventured much beyond Pennsylvania. Our idea of enjoying nature doesn't involve slaughtering a freshly hunted animal. So, when we learned that there was a period during the height of summer when hunting in the Washita was completely banned, we were thrilled. There would be whole parts of the forest virtually deserted, and we'd have the place all to ourselves, or so we thought. We drove 8 hours each day for 3 days to make it to Arkansas from our home in Haverhill, Massachusetts. The thought of driving 1,500 miles straight was unbearable, so we turned it into a road trip, stopping in Philly, D.C., and Nashville. Honestly, I could move to D.C. just for the mumbo sauce. I saw it on Anthony Bourdain and had to try it. Trust me, it does not disappoint. By the time we finally arrived at Washita National Forest, we were more than ready to leave the modern world behind and soak up the peace and beauty of nature. That's a fancy way of saying we were eager to get thoroughly drunk around a roaring fire while belting out Dropkick Murphys songs, which we did, maybe with a little too much enthusiasm. After just 2 of the 4 nights we planned to camp in Washita, we ran out of beer and tobacco. Not the best timing, either. Late in the afternoon, we opened our coolers to find only 3 beers left, barely enough to last us on what would surely be a long walk to the nearest liquor store. Outlaw Liquor was little more than a wooden shack on the edge of a small town called Crystal Springs. It took us about 3 hours of steady walking to get there, but I assure you, it was worth every step. At first, we couldn't tell if we were in a liquor store or a hunting lodge. Taxidermy black bears, deer, turkeys, and foxes were scattered everywhere. Jeff, the owner, showed us the locally made wines and spirits and even offered us samples of some of the more unique brews. We went in planning to grab a 6-pack or 2 and left with our backpack stuffed full of beers, some of Jeff's homemade beef jerky, a few small bottles of homemade wine, and a bottle each of what Jeff called barrel-aged Abraxas, a locally brewed stout with an 11% alcohol content. Yes, you read that right, 11%. The sun was starting to sink below the horizon by the time we got anywhere close to our campsite. Our aching feet from hours of walking were numbed by the alcohol we sipped as we trudged along. I had already opened my pack of jerky, handing out strips to my friends in the hopes it might soak up some of the booze. We had reached that point in a drinking session when our bladders were getting uncomfortably full, so every now and then, one of us would have to step off the trail for a bathroom break. It was a beautiful evening. Crickets chirped, bats flitted around, chirping softly as they used sonar to catch bugs. When it was my turn to take a break, my friends sat down at the edge of the trail with their beers, while I wandered off into the woods to find a suitable spot. I found one, took care of business, and was about to head back when I heard something through the trees. It sounded like people, their voices low, and the crunch of leaves underfoot. In my half-drunken state, I thought it might be fun to introduce myself, maybe share a few drinks, tell some stories, make some new friends, but these people weren't interested in making friends. As I pushed through a thick patch of brush and into a small clearing, I realized just how bad of an idea that was. As soon as I emerged, 3 or 4 men in the clearing turned to look at me, their faces twisted in angry surprise. They were dressed in rough clothes, tattered leather boots, lots of denim, and each held a weapon. Machetes, Bowie knives, and one had a rusted spiked club that looked like it could have been centuries old. Lying hogtied on the ground between them was a young woman, her body covered in bruises and cuts. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Never in my life had I heard anything as disturbing as the sounds she made through her gag. When I finally managed to tear my eyes away from the horrifying scene, I looked up at one of the men standing over her. He was smiling and, with one smooth motion, raised a single finger to his lips, signaling me to stay quiet. I turned and started walking, slowly at first. I didn't want them to think I was going to panic or call the police or something. I tried to stay calm, but after a few seconds, I broke into a run, sprinting back towards the trail. I didn't need to say anything to my friends. They started running as soon as they saw my face. We ran and ran until one of my friends threw up beer and half-digested jerky all over himself. But by that point, we were safe. No one was following us. When I told them what I'd seen, a heated argument broke out. One friend wanted to call the police immediately, while the other insisted we get out of the woods as quickly as possible, which would mean driving drunk until we could find a motel. We couldn't risk calling the cops and getting a DUI, not in Missouri. We decided to call the police first, then get out of there and into a hotel before we got pulled over, breathalyzed, and arrested. We never heard back from the police. My friend gave them all the details over the phone, but I never got any closure about what I saw that night. I often wonder what happened to that girl, if she was rescued and is living a peaceful, happy life now. But sometimes, in the darkest moments, I know deep down that she didn't make it out of Washita. Even if she survived, a part of her would be forever lost in that clearing, taken by cruel, wild men. After heading out on a camping adventure in the Scottish Highlands, we faced some harsh conditions. The weather was relentless, and the rugged terrain didn't make it any easier. Despite these challenges, the trip was largely successful. No one got hurt, no one got lost, and nothing even remotely unsettling happened, at least until the last night. When we finally returned to the small Scottish village where we were supposed to catch our bus, we were both physically and emotionally drained. 5 days in the mountains will do that to you. We had barely slept or eaten, so the sight of a small greasy cafe almost brought tears to our eyes. The locals stared at us as we walked in, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. We were a sight, bloodshot eyes, greasy hair, and clothes reeking of smoke from huddling around fires. The villagers were curious but friendly. The cafe owner asked about our trip, taking great pleasure in our awe of the highlands. Complimenting the locals on their toughness for living in such a barren place always won you points. With full bellies, we headed to the only pub in the village. They welcomed us warmly and even stayed open an hour later than usual so we'd have a place to stay warm while waiting for our late-night bus. We left the pub about 20 minutes before the bus was due, thanking the staff for their hospitality, and made our way down the dimly lit streets towards the village's only bus stop. The bus stop was right next to a small bridge that crossed the river running through the village. With the dim, flickering streetlights, we could tell there was a bridge, but we couldn't see what was on it. As we anxiously watched the clock, counting down the minutes until we could go home to hot showers, warm beds, and proper food, we suddenly heard a sound from the other side of the river, a grunting noise. We were too tired and buzzed to think much of it at first, but the noise grew louder and more distinct until we realized there was someone on the other side of the bridge, sounding drunk and angry. I can't remember who, but someone among us was curious enough to muster the energy to check it out. I didn't watch them go, but I heard their heavy boots clanging against the metal bridge as they slowly climbed to the top. A few moments later, they hurried back down the bridge, their footsteps quicker than before. "Grab your bags now," they hissed, trying to stay quiet. We had no idea what was happening. I thought it might be some kind of prank, a last-minute attempt to add a bit of excitement to our trip. But one look at my friend's terrified eyes told me he was serious. I had never seen him so scared. As if to confirm the urgency, I began hearing the same kind of footsteps on the metal bridge. Someone was coming across the bridge quickly, making the same angry grunting noises. None of us wanted to take a risk, so we grabbed our heavy packs and hurried across the road into a small, dark street in the village. We hid in the shadows, trying to stay out of sight, but still keeping an eye on the bridge, all of us eager to see what had terrified our friend so much. Then we saw him, a man stumbling down the bridge's metal stairs, something shiny in his hand. "Is that a machete?" one of us gasped. As soon as those words were spoken, the man zeroed in on our voices. He raised the large blade, pointing it toward the alleyway where we thought we were hidden. "You!" he shouted in a thick Scottish accent, then began charging down the stairs, waving the machete as he ran. We bolted, sprinting down the dark street with no idea where we were going, just needing to get away from this crazed, blade-wielding man. Whoever was in the lead had the sense to loop around the block. If we got too far from the bus stop, we'd miss our ride, and the next bus wasn't due for another 2 days. He explained this to us the first chance he got, and we all cursed the situation we were in. Go back to the bus stop and risk getting stabbed, or stay away, miss the bus, and end up stranded in the middle of nowhere in Scotland. It was like a military operation. We moved in pairs, covering each other's movements and keeping watch for the machete-wielding maniac. Somehow, we made it back to the bus stop without running into him again. We thought we had lost him and began to relax as much as we could. It was about 5 minutes after the bus was supposed to arrive, and we started to panic again. Some of us feared we'd missed the bus and would need to find a place to stay the night before running into the machete man again. But we didn't have to wait long. A familiar figure emerged from one of the poorly lit side streets. Our hearts sank as we saw the same man, holding the machete. "You!" he shouted again, slowly walking toward us. This time, we decided to take a different approach. Maybe it was the adrenaline or the sheer desperation to catch the bus and get out of there, but we stood our ground. We yelled back at him, pulling out our tiny Swiss Army knives, daring him to come closer. Looking back, it was almost glorious. We went from being terrified, scattering in the streets, to being like warriors defending our territory. What happened next felt like a scene from a movie. As we faced him, he began pacing back and forth in the street, zigzagging toward us while still waving his machete. He seemed slightly put off by our newfound aggression, but not enough to stop him entirely. A dreadful feeling came over me as I realized one of us might actually get hurt. But then, in the distance, near where the road curved away from the river, a police van came around the corner, heading straight for us. It was like the cavalry arriving in an old western, and we were saved. Our bravery doubled, and we even started to move toward the man, pushing him closer to the approaching police van, which he was somehow completely unaware of. He only realized what was happening when the van skidded to a stop behind him, and 3 burly Scottish policemen jumped out and tackled him to the ground. They hit him so hard that you could hear the sickening thud of his head hitting the concrete, but we didn't feel any sympathy. We cheered as the lights in nearby homes flickered on, and faces appeared in windows to watch the scene unfold. Then, just as this was happening, the bus finally arrived, coming around the same corner as the police van. We continued to cheer, grabbing our bags and heading toward our ride home. The police wanted to talk to us about what had happened, but they backed off when we explained that this was our only way out of town. I told them we'd be in touch to give statements later, but we never did. We were just so relieved to get out of there in one piece. I used to love camping. Every waking moment, whether camping or planning a trip, I cherished being outside, far from the stifling monotony of everyday life and trivial concerns. I used to immerse myself deeply in the experience, building shelters instead of bringing a tent, drinking from mountain streams, hunting, and setting traps for food. So, in April of last year, 2 friends and I set off on a 4-night hiking and camping trip on the Appalachian Trail. Carrying packs that weighed over 50 pounds, We trekked 20 miles into the lush green hills before reaching our first significant water source, a long stretch of calm, clear water nestled in a picturesque valley. The journey took 2 days with around 18 hours of nonstop hiking. Our packs painfully dug into our shoulders with each step, but the sense of accomplishment was intoxicating. As days and nights passed, we made our way along the trail, foraging as we went. It was exhausting, a constant challenge, but the peace that nature offers is profound. At night, we skewered hot dogs on sticks, devouring them as we warmed sweet apple cider in our mess tins over the fire. We listened to owls hoot like ghosts and watched embers rise into the air like fireflies as our eyelids grew heavy. We found a good amount of fruit and fresh water was abundant, but our efforts to find protein fell short. We couldn't find any duck eggs, were too slow or inexperienced to trap rabbits, and our makeshift fishing rods weren't as effective as we hoped. We were getting desperate, and although we were trying, one can't live on cereal bars and peanut butter alone. We needed to head to the nearest town, almost 7 miles away. Needless to say, we got lost. After a few hours of walking, we started climbing a fairly steep hill as a shortcut. The whole way up, I remember watching a thick fog cling to the top of the hill, at least 500 meters above us. But it wasn't exactly clinging, it was just waiting for the temperature to drop low enough to roll down onto us, over us. And it did. I remember the image of my friend Chris becoming increasingly obscured as I walked behind him. We tried to stay upbeat, but that changed when we began to see the remains of newborn lambs. April is lambing season, so this wasn't necessarily unusual, but these remains were untouched. No scavengers had gone near these corpses, and there were many of them. We were relieved when the outline of a cottage came into view. We had no idea where we were, and there was no mention of any cottage on our map. My feet ached, and our water supplies were running low since we hadn't anticipated being out or lost for so long. We decided to stop and ask for directions. We had to climb over a low dry stone wall to reach the building since the cottage was oddly set into the hillside. I noted with unease that there was no path leading to or from any road or highway, making the dwelling completely isolated from human contact. We paused as we reached the front gate, or what passed as one. It was made of a few roughly cut tree limbs crudely bound with rusty nails and rotting twine. Chris tried to open it, but there was no hinge. It just fell back into his hands. He set it aside politely, though confused. The small courtyard in front of the door was overgrown with weeds, with grass growing long between the broken concrete slabs beneath our feet. Scattered around the small front garden was an odd collection of items placed in decorative positions. Things were tied to the branches of a sapling in the center of the ragged lawn. Small toy cars, a tennis ball, a hairbrush. A wheelbarrow sat at the base of the tree, filthy from exposure, containing a few soggy books, some VHS cassettes, and a child's action figure. They were strangely arranged in a rough circle around the action figure. Arriving nervously at the door, I reached out, my arm feeling heavy as I made a fist and knocked 3 times, feeling the door shake under the force. Then we waited, listening for any signs of life. Peering through a small, grimy window to the right of the decaying door, I could make out more assorted, seemingly unrelated items scattered on shelves and tables. That's when I turned to Chris. I remember simply saying that we should move on, that no one was home, but he didn't respond. There was something about him. He looked pale and confused. I can hardly describe it now that I try to recall it. He'd been looking through the dirty windows while I knocked on the door and had gotten a much better look inside the house. It was almost like he had seen something but couldn't explain what. He began shaking his head violently, breathing heavily as he hurried out of the small courtyard. I was confused, a little scared, and began shouting after him, asking why he was acting so strange. Yes, the little cottage was odd, but he was acting like he'd seen a ghost. He only replied to me once, through gritted teeth. "We need to leave now. Later that night, while we were nursing beers around our campfire, I finally gathered the courage to ask him what he'd seen through the window. He started shaking his head in that same odd way, stuttering as he tried to find the words to express himself. He explained that someone had been in that cottage the whole time, hiding from us. As I had been knocking, trying to get their attention, they had taken one brief look outside at us, right into my friend's eyes. He said that he had never seen anyone so disturbed, that he couldn't tell if they were disabled or if they had been beaten so badly that their face was disfigured. He said that when they locked eyes, the figure on the other side of the glass looked terrified. But there's no way they could have survived alone up there. Something else was living there too, something that might have been heading back to the cottage to arrive at any moment. I thank God Once a year, my stepdad's family usually has a small camping trip down in South Carolina. My mom's been married to him for about 6 years now, so I've had the chance to join a few of these trips whenever work allows. The first trip I went on was right after Mom and my stepdad got married. My little brother and I packed up my stepdad's truck with camping gear and took the 9-hour drive from our home in Pittsburgh down to South Carolina, where he's from. We had just crossed into West Virginia when we made our first stop for gas. We all got out to stretch and used the bathroom while my stepdad gave an elderly attendant some money to fill up the tank. After finishing in the bathroom, I headed back to the truck and ended up having a chat with the attendant. He seemed nice at first, asking where we were headed and how long we'd be staying. But when I mentioned we were going camping, his attitude changed. "You should always respect nature," he said, his tone serious. "Nature can be unforgiving. Don't bother the animals, and don't leave anything behind except your footprints. Any mess, and the woods have their way of letting you know you're not welcome." I assured him that we respected nature and wouldn't leave any trash behind. But he didn't seem reassured. He finished pumping our gas and went back to his chair without saying another word. A few hours later, we were well into South Carolina when we made a final rest stop before reaching the campgrounds. The rest area was part wildlife preserve, part truck stop, complete with a small information board about the local plants and animals. But something caught my eye in the corner of the board. Carved into the white plastic were the words "Respect Nature." It was the same thing the gas station attendant had said to me. It was strange, sure, but I figured it had to be a coincidence. The same words, yes, but hundreds of miles apart. No way it could be the same person. That kind of thing only happens in silly horror movies. Naturally, I didn't mention this to my mom or stepdad. I mean, why would I? It seemed crazy to think there was a connection between the gas attendant and the carved message. So we just got back in the truck and continued on toward the campground. When we arrived, we greeted the extended family with hugs and handshakes before getting to work setting up the large luxury tent we'd be sleeping in. Once we were done, we hung out with the family and filled up on barbecue. My stepdad's entire family was just as kind as he was, and I should probably mention that my stepdad was a much better parent than our biological dad. So, aside from the initial adjustment period, I was glad my mom had found someone good for her. After an evening around the campfire singing old songs with my step-uncle on the guitar, we headed back to our tents to get some sleep. But when we got there, we saw something lying in the grass near the entrance. A dead bird. My little brother started freaking out. The thing was already starting to decompose, and a huge collective ew echoed through the trees when the smell hit us. My stepdad calmed us down with a joke about my little brother's car farts being way worse, then got rid of the bird as we got ready for bed. But I watched him in the light of his flashlight as he used a stick to move the bird away from our campsite. He knelt down and pulled something from under the bird's wing, something that looked like a note. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off like he hadn't found anything. I wanted to ask more questions, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He was seriously spooked. The next morning, some of the other family members mentioned hearing footsteps outside their tents during the night. They were asking around, trying to find out if anyone had gone for a late-night walk or if we had any sleepwalkers in the group. But no one admitted to being out of their tents so late, and that's when the atmosphere started to get tense. The second night was quieter. There were no footsteps outside anyone's tent, but I still didn't get much sleep. In the dead of night, I heard my little brother's voice across the tent. At first, I thought he was reading aloud, which he often did at that age, but there was no flashlight, so he didn't have a book. I strained to hear what he was whispering, and I thought I was going crazy when I finally made out the words. He was reciting the information from the wildlife board back at the rest stop in South Carolina, word for word, using big words that I knew he didn't know. He eventually stopped, but I was so freaked out that I couldn't get any decent sleep. I woke up exhausted to the sound of my stepdad's voice. He sounded unusually stern. When I stepped outside the tent, I saw why. Everyone was packing up their stuff and loading it into their vehicles. We were supposed to stay for a few more days, but the mood was tense, and no one was talking as they quickly packed up their gear. My stepdad asked me to help and to do it quickly. The look in his eyes told me not to ask questions. We were back on the road to Pennsylvania by noon. I was so relieved to be out of there that I kept quiet the entire way home. But I needed to know what had scared everyone so much. I also needed to ask my stepdad what he had found under that dead bird. But the timing had to be right. We got home late, so late that my stepdad had to carry my sleeping brother from the car to his bed. After a late supper, I finally caught him alone in front of the TV. He knew what I wanted to ask before I even spoke. There had been a note under the bird, just as I'd thought. He told me it said, "Go home," but he figured it was either a prank by local teenagers or one of his cousins who resented that he had moved to the north. So he ignored it. I asked if he'd heard my little brother sleep-talking, but the confused look he gave me told me he hadn't. He did explain, however, what had spooked the family enough to make them leave the campground early. The cousin he suspected of leaving the first note had woken up at dawn with a bladder full of beer. Half asleep, he shuffled out of his tent to relieve himself and then headed back. That's when he noticed the dead deer near the fire pit. Someone had left it as a message. He woke up my stepdad and asked him to move the deer before anyone else saw it and freaked out. Once that was done, they woke everyone else up and got them moving. But that wasn't the worst part. My stepdad explained that whoever had left the deer had carved something into its flesh. They must have done it while the deer was still alive because the letters were formed from clotted blood rather than open wounds. There were just 2 words, 2 small words. I asked him what they said. He sighed,